You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 22nd of January 2025 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, coming to you live from the World Economic Forum here in Davos. I'm Carlota, Rebelo. Coming up on today's program.
Europe must establish itself as a strong global player, as an indispensable player. Let's not forget, there is no ocean separating European countries from Russia.
Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky speaks to a packed Congress Center and issues a strong warning for Europe to step up. Then, with speeches by the United Nations Secretary General and Spain's Prime Minister happening today, we'll go through the agenda for Day 3 of Davos. Also ahead, we'll be speaking with Kelly Clements, the Deputy High Commissioner of the United Nations Refugee Agency. Plus, Monocle's Tom Webb is here. Tom, how has your week been so far?
Hello, Carlota. It may be very busy up here in the mountains, but it's all still happening down in Zurich. I'll be letting you know what the Swiss papers are saying about WEF this year.
More from Tom a bit later. And we'll also be hearing from two WEF veterans on what has changed or not over the years. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Carlota Rebelo, live from Davos. Welcome to a special edition of The Briefing, live from Davos. I'm Carlota Rebelo. It's Day 3 of the World Economic Forum's annual meeting, and the keynote speeches, behind-door meetings and late-night dinners are well underway. Someone who's been keeping a close eye to all things Davos and what's been said on the promenade is Suzanne Lynch, the Global Playbook author and an associate editor at Politico. Suzanne, thank you so much for joining us here in our pop-up studio in Davos. It's a pleasure to be here with you in person after several contributions down the line over the years.
Yeah, it's great to be here. You have a great space, nice view looking out on the, not quite snowy, but almost perfectly white.
I know, it really drives home the point of, the need to address climate change with everyone who's here. But for us journalists, it does make our lives much easier trotting up and down the promenade. How have the first few days been for you? Look,
it's been a very interesting experience. I first came to Davos 10 years ago, and in a way it feels like it hasn't changed, but in other ways it has. I think, the dominance now of AI, crypto, the tech companies, they really have emerged as major players here in Davos, along with the big financial institutions, the banks, and of course the political figures that come here. Now, this year I feel there are fewer political heavyweights as such. Obviously, the new US president is not here, even though he's looming over events, and he will be delivering a online speech on Thursday. But, people like Emmanuel Macron of France, Keir Starmer of the UK, they're not here. Modi from India. I think it's, again, a lot of the big finance chiefs, a lot of those meetings are taking place behind the scenes, but they're very important. CEOs, top C-suite executives from these banks, from sovereign wealth funds, some of the world's biggest asset managers, they're the real, people who are making this happen here behind the scenes. And some of them are on stage giving various panels about the state of the economy, but a lot of the business is done behind closed doors.
Now, WEF has always been a sort of event that is for CEOs, that is for the heads of the big companies, and over the years evolved into becoming also a jamboree of leaders. Do you feel like in a weird way, is it going back to its original purpose? Or do you think this is a one-off year because of circumstances and timing that we're seeing a shorter VIP list?
Yeah, it's interesting. This year has got this particular geopolitical context because it just coincides with Trump administrations coming into office. But, those banking and finance people have always been here, and I think they're the people who are going to continue to come. Now, one of the reasons they are here is because they get to meet regulators and ECB people, central bankers, governments. And one of the interesting aspects is the fact that some countries, Belgium, for example, I'm thinking of, it's got its own national house. Ukraine, obviously, countries looking for investment. Oman, for the first year, has a pavilion along the promenade. So it's these countries' opportunity to get in front of investors, trying to get in that FDI, that foreign direct investment that a lot of countries are vying for. So it's that nexus of business and politics, which in a way is what makes Davos work, but it's also, of course, one of the most controversial aspects of Davos, this idea that power and money are so closely intertwined here.
Well, let's turn our focus to what's happening inside the Congress Center. As we know, this is an event where a lot happens both inside and outside. But yesterday, some remarkable speeches, including by Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky, pretty much calling on Europe to wake up.
Yeah, it was quite interesting. I mean, people were wondering what he would say, given that he was speaking so soon after Trump's inauguration. But in fact, as you say, he didn't focus on the US, he focused on Europe and, called out Europe for what he sees as its lackluster defence spending. Now, the EU and European leaders would push back on that. I mean, Germany is by far the biggest contributor to Ukraine in terms of aid and money and weapons after America, for example. So there's been a big change there in Germany. But it was interesting, I thought, that this is the tactic that Zelensky is taking. I think he was speaking, like a lot of people here, to an audience of one, to Trump. So I think he is, channeling Trump in a sense, knowing what the new Republican administration is thinking about its own continuing commitment to Ukraine. But it was an interesting intervention. Now, Zelensky is still here. He's expected to have some engagements throughout today, as well as bilateral meetings. So I expect that Ukraine and what's next for Ukraine will continue to be a theme here.
Now, also today, we'll be hearing from a couple other keynote speeches, including the UN's own Antonio Guterres. Do we have any indication of what might be coming, what might be the main message that he wants to get across? Of course, he's speaking at a time that until the moment that we are talking, the ceasefire deal still holds in Gaza. So, of course, this idea of cooperation it seems to be on everyone's mind. Yeah,
exactly. So we will be hearing from him today. Now, of course, the UN is one of the institutions that's going to come in for quite a battering under the Trump administration, if we're to believe what Donald Trump has said, and also UN agencies. So this is an institution under pressure. So let's see if he refers to that. I also expect that he's going to talk about climate change. You mentioned that at the beginning, Carlota, about the lack of... There really hasn't been much conversation here, I feel, about climate change. Even as you mentioned, we can just see the lack of snow in comparison to other years. And we do expect him to make some mention of that in his speech today, and really also put it up to private sector investment to do its bit in terms of climate goals, etc.
And it is remarkable how, one of the things that we've all been talking about prior to WEF was the Global Risks Report that came out. And we saw that climate change, even though it is still a risk, it has dropped down expectedly, with conflict being number one. But then when you look at the long term, it jumps straight back up. So it is quite surprising to see it so removed from the agenda this year compared to previous editions. You've also attended previous editions of WEF. I don't know if you share that feeling as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, surveys also show that climate change is still a big issue for a lot of the younger generation. And this is one of the issues with Davos. We don't see that many. I've certainly not seen that many younger people around here. That is something to do with access, the fact that these senior executives are obviously older than the average person, and that's why they're here. But, you don't have a Greta Thunberg or a big climate figure who has spoken so far. Let's see. So as a result, I think it's been very peripheral, the discussion. And now, Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission President, did talk about the climate change agreement, the Paris Climate Agreement, in her speech on Tuesday, and pledging the EU's commitment to that. And the EU has been a leader on climate change. However, I think also the EU is starting, it's at the beginning of its 5-year term, and climate and the green agenda is not as prominent as it was in the last 5 years. That is for sure. There's been a certain backlash, particularly, I'm thinking German business, the farming community across Europe, to some of the green regulations. So we don't hear figures like von der Leyen, for example, talking about the Green Deal, talking about climate as much as she may have done 5 years ago.
And Suzanne, we are at lunchtime now, which doesn't necessarily mean approaching half of the day here in Davos, because work continues well into the night. What has the rest of the afternoon in store for you?
Well, when I'm finishing here, I'm heading up to the mountain, the Schatzalp. There's an event up there. And then, I think the rhythm here is to kind of... Pedro Sanchez, for example, the Spanish Prime Minister, he's going to be speaking this afternoon. It'll be interesting to see what he says. The Spanish economy doing very well, but he's also a left-wing Prime Minister at a time when a lot of right-wing Prime Ministers are on the ascendant. So I think it's going to be interesting to see what he says. Also, some of the economic stories about, Rachel Reeves, the UK Chancellor, she's here today. Where's the UK economy going? And the fact that the European economy is falling behind when it comes to the US. So that theme is crucial, and it's very prominent in a lot of the conversations that have been happening. Then, of course, this evening there are a few dinners going on, and that happens all through the week here. And, of course, the nightcaps, as they're known. But a lot of the dinners, again, I met someone earlier this morning. I was at an event, and it was a senior banker who said they were at a dinner with the new, I won't say new, but the possible next German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz. He let that slip that he'd met him last night. So they're the kind of meetings that are happening here throughout the day and into the evening each night here at Davos.
Suzanne Lynch, thank you for joining us here in this special edition of The Briefing, live from Davos. It was a strong warning issued by Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky, asking European leaders to be more than just bystanders. With all eyes now set on the new resident of the White House and what he will do next, this is a key moment for Ukraine and its allies. So let's delve into this, because I'm delighted to say that joining me here in the studio is Ambassador Kurt Volker, former US Ambassador to NATO and former US Special Representative for Ukraine. Good afternoon.
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks for having me.
Let's look precisely at Zelensky's speech. What did you make of his take on a strong US and a weaker Europe?
Well, he's trying to encourage Europe to step up and do more. And that is both financial and military support for Ukraine and speeding up EU processes and support for Ukraine's security assurances, all of those things. But related to that is his understanding, which is quite accurate, that President Donald Trump wants to see Europe do more. And so he's aligning himself with President Trump. And he is trying to make sure that U.S. support for Ukraine is secured by Europe doing its share.
And do you think Europe will be able to do its share?
I do think so. I think there's a strong commitment in Europe to Ukraine. I think they understand that if Ukraine fails, if Putin wins, even in the long run, that this is a threat to Europe. This is a threat to the EU. It's a threat to security. It's a threat to the economy. So in order to secure a space for Europe and a prosperous economy for Europe, Europe knows that this is really important. And we've seen things like the creation of a commissioner for defense, Andris Kubilius, as a recognition Europe's got to do more on defense industry. We've seen the decision to take the interest of the frozen Russian assets and use that for Ukraine. I hope that the next step is to take the frozen Russian assets and seize them, and use that also for Ukraine, including procurement of defense articles.
Well, I wanted to touch you exactly precisely on that, the effectiveness of sanctions and of military aid. What is your take on it?
Well, it's very interesting because in the last week of the Biden administration finally put in place serious sanctions. It should have been done years ago. And they were reluctant to put sanctions on the Russian energy sector in a way that they felt might risk raising gasoline prices in the United States. In their last week in office, they decided they could afford to put in the sanctions in place. President Trump has announced a massive expansion of U.S. energy production and export, so there's no worry about global prices. In fact, global prices will probably fall. And as a result, we can afford to keep these sanctions in place. And I think this is going to have a much bigger impact on Russia. Even now, Russia has burnt through a lot of foreign exchange reserves. They're down to $30-some billion worth. They are having very high inflation in Russia right now, and that is increasing. They have high interest rates, 21%, and there's a cap on those now. Naturally, a good central banker would want to make it higher to drive down inflation, but that's not happening. So they are printing money. They are drawing down foreign exchange reserves. They are decoupled from the financial system. They are having a hard time with energy exports, especially because of the sanctions on vessels carrying Russian energy. So I think that these will have a very strong impact.
And let's turn slightly here, because earlier this week, yesterday, in fact, we heard as well from Hungary and Slovakia, who reaffirmed their opposition to Ukraine's membership bid to NATO. Were you surprised at all by that?
Not at all surprised. That's been well known that's Viktor Orban's position. No surprise that Fico is saying that too. I think it's a huge mistake, but I think it is where we are. I think in the short term, what we need is a ceasefire, and that's going to require convincing Putin that he has basically run out of rope. He can't gain anymore. He's having extraordinary losses economically and militarily, and it's only going to get worse. And I think that we're getting to that point. And I think it's very fortunate for President Trump that when he calls Putin, that's the situation that Putin is already in. And you may have seen President Trump's remarks in the Oval Office yesterday, where he's commenting on this and saying that it's in bad shape and he's really damaged the country, which is true. Now, security assurances for Ukraine are the essential next step. It's one thing to have a ceasefire. It's another to make a permanent peace. The best security assurances in Europe, the one that works and has always worked, is NATO membership. Anything that's not NATO membership is by definition less than NATO membership. So we have to think about what would be less but still effective. The Budapest Memorandum from 1994 was not effective. Here, the US, UK, France, and Russia promised to protect Ukraine's territorial integrity with its then borders, including Crimea, in exchange for Ukraine giving up nuclear weapons. Well, when Russia violated that, nobody did anything. So those security assurances weren't worth the paper they were written on. What we need now is something that is much more real.
And just finally, of course, we are still with a couple of days left of this edition of WEF. Do you still find it a conducive platform for actual conversation and for things to move forward?
It is the most intensive, interesting, and frustrating bazaar that you can go to in the bazaar of ideas. Everyone who is here is interesting and worth talking to. You grab a few minutes with someone, you learn something, lots of discussions, lots of panels, lots of dinners and lunches. You get a lot out of it. But it is completely chaotic, disorganized, in the cold, in the slush, and it is a frustrating way to go about doing that, but it works somehow.
Ambassador Kurt Volker, thank you very much for joining us here on The Briefing, live from Davos. You're listening to a special edition of The Briefing, live from Davos. I'm Carlota Rebelo. The latest numbers show that over 122 million people worldwide are forcibly displaced, either due to persecution, conflict, violence, or human rights violations. Indeed, for 12 years in a row, the number of refugees has continued to increase. So it is crucial that aid agencies, institutions, private companies, and governments all work together to address this pressing challenge. At the helm of all of this is the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, which is mandated to aid and protect refugees and stateless people around the globe. Well, I'm delighted to say that joining me here in our Davos studio is Kelly Clements, the Deputy High Commissioner of UNHCR, the United Nations Refugee Agency. Kelly, thank you very much for joining us here in the studio. Can you begin by setting the scale of this crisis? What are the main areas of concern for UNHCR at the moment?
So thanks for having us on the program again. This is a moment in history where we've never seen the number of families and people that are forced to flee because of conflict and war and persecution, and increasingly because of climate-related reasons, but also inequalities. So you can't find one part of the world right now that is not on fire. I think the four big areas, one that is not talked about enough, which is Sudan, and we have 12 million people, mostly internally displaced people who have not crossed an international border, some 3 million refugees that have been fleeing the war that continues to rage on. Ukraine, of course, in terms of the continued bombardment in various parts of the country, continued displacement, and millions of both refugees but also internally displaced people. The Middle East, of course, with a very dynamic situation. Hopefully the ceasefire continues to hold in Gaza, but the knock-on effects in Lebanon and earlier in both bombardment and other displacement. We saw 1 million Lebanese displaced, but also there is 1.25 million Syrian refugees that have been there for now 13, 14 years. And new developments, of course, in Syria with regard to the leadership changes and so on. Potential on the horizon that you could see refugees choose to go back. But there are, of course, a number of steps before that. And then, of course, Venezuela, which we've seen, of course, continued leadership challenges in terms of some of the persecution reasons for people to have left Venezuela years ago and continued displacement there. But, I could mention Asia as well with Myanmar, and that is something that is not at all covered in the media in terms of the continued displacement of civilians and over 1 million Rohingya refugees that remain in asylum in Bangladesh and elsewhere. So in terms of the global picture, we have about 123 million people that are forced to flee around the globe. This is the 12th year that we've seen an increase in that number, and unfortunately, numbers don't tell the story. They're individual families, individual stories of loss, but also of hope of what they want to do to rebuild, to be able to support themselves. And so this is a global situation that is a challenge because of geopolitics, because of the lack of peace, because of policymakers not able to discuss and be able to find ways forward, and civilians caught in the middle. And I think what is different now in terms of challenges for refugees that are fleeing some of this brutality is the sheer magnitude and the egregiousness of the impacts on those civilians. And so they have, in these situations, and I'm coming back to the way that I started with Sudan, what they are coming to in Chad and South Sudan, Ethiopia, Uganda, and other locations is harrowing stories of loss of family members, attacks and violence on themselves personally. And so the needs are great. Everything from where do they find a place to sleep safely to what do they do about trying to rebuild their lives? Where do they go? Do they stay? Is there support for them to stay? And for the international community, this is also a very dynamic period for all kinds of reasons, but given the massive increase in needs and the very constrained and limited ability that the international community has to support those needs, this is where we're challenged like never before to make that aid go further.
And Kelly, just one final question. As you mentioned, we are indeed here at Davos. It is a busy week with people from all levels and all sectors in and out. What would make this a successful annual meeting for you? What are you hoping to take back with you that, sustains the next 12 months? Because this tends to be an event that sets the tone for the year ahead and for what the world collectively is looking as its priorities. So I'm curious on what would make this a successful edition for you.
Well, the World Economic Forum, I think, has set the stage or set the table, as they say, with regard to their annual risk assessment, where you have climate, obviously part of this, but conflict in particular as part of the top 5 drivers of what the world really should sit up and take notice of. And for us, there is no other gathering like this where you have business, public leaders, civil society, and others come together, not just for discussions, but it's for action. And I've been here a few times now, and what I've noticed is how those conversations have matured. When I first came, let's say 2016, 2017, it was, more of an education of, what are we talking about when we talk about forced displacement? I think that there is wide recognition now that this is something that involves the international community as a whole and needs all of us. And so what we're trying to do is obviously increase the number of strategic partnerships that we have with those businesses and foundations that can help drive change, impact, results, and are obviously trying to do more with less, I think, is another theme, but also that we don't have forced displacement and refugee situation that is just seen in political terms and in polarizing terms, but where you see those participants here at Davos see this as something that can be a force for good in terms of being able to take action. And we mentioned that at the very top, why it's in business interest to do this.
Kelly Clements, the Deputy High Commissioner of UNHCR, thank you for joining us here on The Briefing, live from Davos. You're back with The Briefing on Monocle Radio. I'm Carlota, Rebelo. It's been a busy couple of days for Team Monocle up here in the mountains, but also keeping busy and keeping us informed was our own Tom Webb, who's been broadcasting all week from our Zurich outpost. But today, he hopped on the SBB to come join us in Davos, and I'm delighted to say that Tom joins me now in the studio. Hello, Tom.
Hello, Carlota. It was a beautiful journey. Usually I'm driving you up the mountain at 100 kilometers an hour. Instead, I was sitting in second class with a whole array of people that are attending today, views out the window, anti-aircraft, guns, helicopters, and a very strange addition on the promenade, DHL delivery robots.
I know, and there's there's a robot dog as well on the promenade. As you go out and about for the rest of the afternoon, you will spot them. But tell our listeners what you've been up to in Zurich.
Well, The Globalist is broadcasting live all week from our Zurich studio. Andrew Miller has come from London to host each day, and it's really wonderful to be in the Monocle Cafe with such an audience watching the output live. We are here all week. Do come by. We're interviewing all the movers and shakers who are coming to Davos via Zurich. We've got all the think tanks, some of the big speakers, getting a sense of why they're attending this year, and also the importance of Switzerland as a host.
Well, let's stay on the theme of Switzerland as a host, because of course the talk up here in Davos all week has been all about the reaction to the inauguration. It's been Donald Trump's presidency has already been the main discussion topic over every single day. From what you've been hearing and the people you've been speaking to, how have you taken that Switzerland has reacted to the new president?
It's such a good question, and every day the front page of all the newspapers here in Switzerland is Trump's inauguration, Trump's first day, and actually very little about Davos, because Switzerland seemed to be obsessed with his immigration policy. Very little about what trade means for Switzerland. And we had Oliver Streibers, who's a political professor, come in to talk about why Switzerland is so obsessed with the immigration policy. And it's because Switzerland, it's always been the key issue for the country, and it has been for 40 years. And Swiss politicians are very interested in seeing someone do something about immigration in quite a heavy-handed way. Will all of this talk actually happen? And what does that mean for far-right politics in neighbouring countries?
Now, Tom, you are indeed with a packed schedule here today, because you have to hop back on that train, back to Zurich to deliver us that Globalist tomorrow morning. So tell us, what are you looking out for this afternoon? Who are you hoping to speak with? And in which houses might we find you?
Well, it's all about Asia. We're really keeping an eye on who is here from Asia and who isn't. So Yoon Suk-yeol had a huge presence 2 years ago, big speech. South Korea aren't here. They've got a lot of problems back at home. China, however, have sent a huge delegation. It's the second time round they've done this. And yesterday we heard the big speech from the Chinese Vice Premier, Ding Xuyang, calling for the international community to promote a beneficial and inclusive economic globalization. And I really want to find out how people are working with China this year. In fact, I'm going to an event in Swiss House about how green technology can be used to make travel cleaner. And I'll be speaking to a startup that are working with Chinese technology to make sure that aviation is going to be cleaner next year.
Well, listeners can stay tuned to all of our coverage from Davos throughout the rest of the week. Tom, thank you very much for joining us. That was Monocle's Deputy Head of Radio, Tom Webb. This is The Briefing, live from Davos. Finally today, while the buzz around Davos continues with record high attendance, there have been several questions about a few of the notable absences by world leaders. So, is Davos losing its appeal? And as it reaches 55 years, could the World Economic Forum endure another half decade? Well, I'm joined in the studio now by two World Economic Forum veterans and familiar voices to Monocle listeners to get their view on all of it. With me is the broadcaster Juliet Linley and Rob Cox, the CEO of Frontward Strategic Communications. Juliet, Rob, great to have you both join us here in the studio. Rob, I want to begin with you because the very first time you came to WEF was 25 years ago. How much has it changed since then? Is it still the same?
I came as a journalist in 2000, and it's been so much the same. Everybody comes. I mean, all the CEOs, all the big business leaders, huge investors, entrepreneurs. Every entrepreneur out there with a great idea and a bit of money comes here to get a bit more money and a lot more friends. And so that is still the same. It's just that now you see the entire promenade is plastered with their logos, their brand names. They've taken over shoe shops for $1 million a week. So that certainly is a big difference. It's become more commercial in that respect. And then, of course, you see the the many countries or states that I didn't even know existed around the world that have got storefronts, and some of them offering some free coffee and Kurdistan tea, pretty good. And then inside the conference center, it's very similar. I mean, you have heads of state coming. Okay, this year is a little light because, well, you had the inauguration on Monday and 400 executive orders issued since. So folks from the states are there in Washington. And then you just have so much political discord, as it were, in other capitals. So I think that's kept constrained people like Macron and Keir Starmer, others. But you had the German leader and potentially his successor here. You had Ursula von der Leyen. They still get incredible drawing power, and that hasn't changed.
Do you feel the same, Juliet? Because the absences have been what everyone's been talking about, how those are more telling than actually who's here.
That's the thing. And on day one, it became a let's watch the inauguration day at the WEF rather than actually looking at what was on the agenda at the WEF. It's not the end of the week, though, and there are talk of perhaps Mr. Trump himself, or if in any case, one of his many tech bros, perhaps flying in to show their faces.
What about the Pope? Is the Pope coming?
He's making an address, but we don't know yet.
It might be in person. So much buzz. But I do wonder, how long can the WEF keep going? Every year, don't you feel that everyone is sort of, but this isn't sustainable? I mean, literally not sustainable, because it's going against all the climate change policies that anyone would want to enact. But also, it's this rich kids club, rich brothers club, whatever. But actually, it has such an important role to play, just bringing people together. It doesn't necessarily have to be in Davos. It is in Davos. Klaus Schwab brought it to Davos. He's not going to be here for another 55 years. But do you think we're going to still be here? Well, you and I, so sure.
Well, I don't think I'll be here in 25 years. But I do think it will continue to be relevant. I think it is. You can look at it and say, oh my God, all the billionaires and the plutocrats and this. But, it isn't just that. And there is a need to have people from, whether it's the most important nonprofits and NGOs and startups and new ideas and countries seeking capital and those with capital and those with means all in one place. There is just a need for that. Now, you have things like the COP, the climate conference that the UN holds. That has become a very big deal, but it's not the same. And I have attended that, and that's 2 weeks. Some of those days feel Davos-like, but there's nothing quite like this. Whether it stays in Davos, I don't know. But there is something about keeping it to 3,000 people. At least in 3,000 attendees, and there are hundreds of hangers-on. So that is where it becomes difficult for the town, of course. But I have a hard time seeing. This is not saying that it's all great that oligarchy should reign or whatever you want to say, but I think there is a role for it.
Well, you mentioned there the 3,000 attendees. That's just the registered participants. And as we were discussing just in the beginning, the amount of other people that stop and travel through Davos to attend the public-facing sessions, to visit the houses on the promenade. And yes, it is an interesting exercise in real estate to see who's where and if they've been downgraded or upgraded from the previous year. And a good display of realizing which nation is trying to put themselves out there each year. Like, interestingly, the USA House for the first time making a debut on the promenade.
Is that the one with the eagle and all?
Yeah, it wasn't obvious with the eagle and the Star-Spangled Banner.
Actually, it's not the United States.
It's a USA House.
I'm wondering who's behind that. But that kind of thing, like all of a sudden it raises some consciousness. Now, some of that could be if you are in some of these emerging market countries and you're looking at a lot of money being spent in Davos, you might wonder what the ROI is. Does it bring, manufacturing or tech jobs or that kind of thing to your state? But I mean, that is part of it. And the South, I do recommend the coffee at the Neom House. Neom, which again, if you know what that is.
Tell us
an interesting choice of coffee location.
Right? It certainly is a very big dream by the Kingdom of Saudi and the Crown Prince himself. And it is, he unveiled it a few years back, and we were all like, "What is going on?" I mean, it was basically to create a. I mean, you go in there, you feel like it's something out of like a James Cameron movie, right? But I mean, it looks like it's inspired by something like science fiction. But the coffee's really good.
But the coffee's really good.
I was interested in seeing Brazil had a house this year because obviously Brazil is hosting COP30 later in Belém in November. So it is almost like the beginning of a year for Brazil in trying to put themselves out there. And I saw that in the Congress Center, one of the sessions as well was about kind of Brazil's moment. Do you find, with both of your experiences of past editions and this one, that there's a correlation a lot about what's discussed inside the Congress Center and what is happening outside. Are we able to take a temperature of the world by looking at what panels are being put together?
For sure, Rob, no?
I think so. Or just, and who shows up. Okay, yeah, I mean, maybe it's a little light this year, but I mean, I saw Dilma Rousseff many years ago when Brazil was sent, as you know, every few years, Brazil's the new great thing that's going to happen. And then there's a problem, and then someone restores it. But, she was here giving a big address where she really set down at least, her view about capital and Brazil's future, and that was interesting. I mean, I saw the Brazil House here. It looked to be like a group of companies, Brazilian companies getting together. So that's kind of interesting. If to me, I was interested in going. I didn't have time, and I didn't get invited to probably a really fun party that
samba party.
But
the temperature must have been high.
Juliet, Linley and Rob Cox, thank you for joining us. And that's all for this special edition of The Briefing, live from the World Economic Forum. It was produced by myself and Esri Bandley here in Davos. Our studio manager back in London was Flynn Simons, and happy birthday to him. The Briefing is back in Davos tomorrow at the same time. We'll be live from our pop-up radio studio here in the Swiss mountains, located at the Hub Culture Chalet on the Promenade. I'm Carlota Rebelo. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.